You have all heard the expression, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And it applies to many things in the world we inhabit, but perhaps none more so than the ways our schools, our public schools, let us emphasize, disproportionately fail and cast off our poor children and our children of color. My own view is that in terms of public intellectuals today, who think and write about this outrage in a way that at once gives us constructive understanding of the system of inequality and also serves as advocacy for the children that we fail, that amongst those people, Pedro Noguera is one of our two most important figures active today. And while I'm here to introduce Pedro Noguera, I won't be coy. I'll simply mention that the second for me would be Jonathan Kozel. Pedro Noguera earned his own teaching credential while majoring in sociology and history at Brown University. In noting this, I think we might take a moment to ask whether it might make some small contribution if many more selective liberal arts institutions, such as our own colleges here in Claremont, joined Brown University in having undergraduate teacher training programs. After a stint as a classroom teacher in Providence, Pedro Noguera went on to Berkeley, where he earned his PhD in sociology. While in graduate school, he continued his work as a teacher, working in the schools of Oakland, California. Since that time, Dr. Noguera has been one of our leading urban sociologists, and in particular, one of our most insightful thinkers and observers in regard to the inequalities of opportunity and inequalities of outcome in our schools. He is the author or co-author of a series of must-read books for anyone concerned with K-12 education. These works include City Kids, City Teachers, co-authored with Bill Ayers and Greg Mitchell, as well as the edited volume, Unfinished Business, Closing the Achievement Gap in Our Nation's Schools, and most recently, and it's just a beautiful, passionate, brilliant book, The Trouble with Black Boys, and Other Reflections on Race, Equity, and the Future of Public Education. I will mention, in addition, his recent writings about educational policy that have appeared and I'm sure will continue to appear in the nation. And if you want to keep up with the unfolding debate about education reform policy, read Pedro Noguera in the Nation over the last year, and I'm sure into the next year and future years. Pedro Noguera is currently the Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education at New York University and a trustee of the State University of New York. Before I ask you to join me in welcoming him to speak today, let me take a brief detour, as we always do at the Munroe Center, and encourage all of you who are interested in schooling to also join us for our next speaker, Shalini Shankar, who will be speaking here on Tuesday, March 8th at the same time on style and language use among youth of the new immigration. Today, it is our great privilege to welcome Pedro Noguera, whose talk is entitled, Creating the Schools We Need, What We Can Learn from Schools That Are Succeeding in Communities Where Poverty is Concentrated and Hope is Scarce. Please join me in welcoming him to speak today.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here at Pitzer. I want to thank Dan Siegel, first of all, for that warm introduction, and the staff and others who helped to arrange my visit, and the students I got to speak to this afternoon. It was a real pleasure to have that interaction. And to all of you for coming out. I particularly want to thank the teachers from the area. I know there are a number of teachers from this area who've come out. I consider it a real honor to have you in the audience today as well. Let me say that I have, over the years, figured out that the only way to say anything that makes any sense about education is to actually be in schools. And I think that part of the reason why the policymakers who would like to fix our schools often make so little sense is because they never appear in schools except for photo opportunity. And what's interesting, I figured that out a while ago. I figured it out first as a teacher in Providence and Oakland, later as a school board member in Berkeley, California, where I served for 4 years. Can't say I enjoyed that, but I did learn a lot about what it takes to manage a school system, particularly during a time of fiscal crisis, which is yet again visited upon California. And as a researcher and as a person who engages in, to some degree, policymaking. Now as a trustee for the State University of New York, I serve on the committee that authorizes charter schools. So I'm right in the middle of all the debates about charter schools. I'm very proud to say that the charter schools we authorize are some of the best in the country. We've been recognized as the best charter authorizer in the country. I'm also challenged, though, in the role because I'm concerned about the ways in which charter schools are being used by some to undermine public education. But as I said, I think that it's being in the mix, especially because as an academic, it's so easy to not be, that I found to be most rewarding and to give me the greatest insights about what's actually happening in our schools. And I'll draw on that. Now, let me start with a story that reflects that understanding the importance of being there. While I was in graduate school at Berkeley, I was asked by the mayor of Berkeley to take a leave from my studies and become her chief of staff. And because I was only 26, I said yes. And I was then placed in charge or responsible for addressing major social and economic problems facing the city, from homelessness to the crack epidemic, which had just hit our city and was resulting in a lot of crime and violence across the city, economic development, just a number of big challenging issues. And took me a little while to realize that although I had this highly visible position with direct access to the mayor, that in fact I couldn't solve any of the problems. Because the problems were not the kinds that could be fixed easily. Because their roots had to do more with the economy of our community and the ability of our city to respond to the needs of the people who live there, even in a liberal community like Berkeley. And I also came to realize that I was going to be blamed for why we didn't solve the problems, because I was the one that would have to go out and explain to the homeless why there was no housing. I'd go out to the communities that the drive-by shooting, explain why the police didn't respond. And I was getting tired of being the flag catcher for the mayor. And one day I was approached by a good friend. This friend was an administrator in the Berkeley Public Schools who had a reputation as an advocate for students who were not well served. And because of his advocacy, he had run afoul with the superintendent, who decided that she was tired of him, and to get rid of him, she was going to make him the principal of the alternative school, the continuation school, as they call it here in California. Those of you who are in education know the continuation school is often for the kids that no one wants to serve. Kids who've gotten into trouble, kids who with poor academic records, poor attendance, etc. And she did this hoping that this would force him into early retirement, because he was already well into his 60s. But instead of being moved to retire, my friend George Perry got rejuvenated. He said, well, this is why I was in education in the first place, to make a difference for kids like these, so I'm happy to take this job on. So he comes to see me one day with one of his students. And he says, Pedro, I'd like you to meet this young man. His name is John. And I want you to encourage him to run for student body president of my school. I had been the student body president at UC Berkeley, and he thought that maybe I could somehow convince him that this was a worthwhile use of his time. But I immediately look at John and figure out that John is into something else. Because John has thick gold chains across his neck. He's got gold rings on all his fingers, gold teeth in his mouth. I figure anybody with that much gold is probably doing something illegal. And I'm wondering, why would the principal want him to be the student body president? But I trust my friend George Perry, and I start to talk to the young man, and after a few minutes, it becomes clear to me that this young man is very intelligent. He is a natural leader. He's going to run the school either way. But George is wise enough to realize that he needs this young man on his side, not against him. So I'm so taken by the young man, the potential I see, and by George's willingness to work with him in this role, I said, well, I need to go visit the school, because I didn't even know that we had this alternative school in Berkeley. And for those of you who don't know, Berkeley is one of the first districts in the country to voluntarily integrate schools through shared busing. But when I pull up, I find a school that's completely segregated. And in fact, it's hard to tell it's a school at all because there are very few students in class. Lots of kids in the parking lot, by their cars, music from the radios, smoke in the air, not all cigarette smoke. Walk through the school, no more than 2 or 3 kids in the class, teachers reading the newspaper. I stop and I talk to the teachers and find out what it's like to work there. They all say it's fine, no problem. We don't bother them, they don't bother us. Everybody gets along. So I went back to see George. I said, George, I want to work with you. I'd rather do this than continue working in the mayor's office. He said, great, we need you. I need help. I said, but you got a big problem. He said, well, I know. He said, but it's really just 2 problems. I said, just 2? He said, yep. The teachers and the kids, that's the problem. I said, well, I guess you're right. But I said, that's pretty big, though. And he said, yeah, well, I can deal with the teachers. I need your help with the kids. I said, well, how are you going to deal with these teachers? He said, well, I'm going to ask for a lesson plan every period, every day. I'm going to shake it up. And he did. It took about 2 weeks before half the teachers put in for transfers. But the attraction for working in a school like that was that you didn't have to work. Because no one expected anything of these students. And you got out at 1:30 in the afternoon. Another big draw. The fact that now he was insisting they actually work made some teachers decide they're going to transfer, because one of the ugly secrets of public education is there are often places where teachers can hide who don't want to have to work. The other half were teachers who actually said, you know what, I used to be a teacher. I could do this again if I saw you were serious about teaching these kids. So we have something to work with. I decided I better go out to the parking lot to talk to the kids, find out what's happening out there. And first thing I learned from talking to the young people was something that really surprised me. And that was that all the kids at this school were old enough to quit. Because you had to be at least 16 to be sent there. They were old enough to quit, but they were coming. They weren't going to class, weren't doing any work for the most part, but they were coming to school. And the reason why they were coming to school, I learned, is because they had not given up on themselves. They still believed they needed a diploma because they had goals and aspirations, and they figured that getting this diploma was at least a step. They didn't get it that you actually had to learn something and that you needed to actually, do the work, but they were coming. I figured, well, since they're coming, maybe we can figure out a way to get them to come to class. Then I thought, well, we're not teaching them anything, though. So how can I get them to go to class? Because this is a school that confused being low-skilled, and most of our students were low-skilled, with being unintelligent. So the only thing we offered was remedial reading, remedial math, etc. So then I thought, I said, George, we need to teach these kids something. And he says, okay, well, I've got them. They're ready to do lesson plans. Now we got to figure out what to teach them. I said, well, let me go back, find out what they're interested in. It turned out the #1 interest my students had was money. They were really interested in money because these were poor kids. Some of them were parents themselves who were trying to figure out how to support children. Some of them were helping families and trying to pay rent. They were struggling to get by, they were struggling to survive, and so money was a real priority. And some of them were involved in selling drugs. And I figured just say no definitely wasn't working with these guys. And we had to figure out some way to show them that it would be possible to earn a living legally and get an education. Well, it helped that I'd been in the mayor's office because the city of Berkeley, just before I left, was negotiating with Bayer Laboratory. Bayer Laboratory is a large German-based company, biotech company, that produces Bayer aspirin, among other things. And they were negotiating for a long-term development deal with the city. And the city was asking for concessions. I'd been part of those negotiations, and I decided I was going to go directly to the CEO to circumvent the negotiations and make a proposal. And I said, why don't you create a biotech academy at our school? Because it's a German company, and because in Germany they use career academies and apprenticeships as a way to get young people into technical fields, he said, well, this makes total sense, makes so much more sense than anything the city's been asking for. Because we have a need for well-trained entry-level employees, which we have difficulty finding. So we proceeded to develop this biotech academy. To be in the academy, you had to have 4 years of science and 4 years of math, which was unheard of at our school because, as I said before, we only offered remedial courses. But we decided we would offer the 4 years of science and 4 years of math, and we would also create internships at the site, summer jobs, and then we decided, why not extend it beyond entry-level jobs to create a real career pathway? So we worked with the local community college. And then we worked with Cal State Hayward because we thought we should have a pathway into a 4-year college. We created a biotech academy that is now 15 years old, that involves 7 high schools, 5 biotech firms. Our students in 1988 were making $14 an hour as an entry-level technician. It's amazing, you put these kids in a white jacket and some goggles and they start to really think they're scientists. Now we did a lot more I don't have time to explain, but it took us 3 years to turn a school that had been a dumping ground for bad kids and bad teachers into a viable alternative. Now I start with that because the issue of what to do about chronically failing schools is one that the federal government has decided they're going to really focus on. And President Obama, even in the State of the Union address, spoke quite a bit about education, about the importance of education for economic competitiveness, for innovation in our economy, for ensuring that this country will be not surpassed by China and India and the other rising economies in the world. And while I am pleased to see that the President continues to make education a priority, especially given how many other issues are demanding attention, from the 2 wars to Egypt to the economy to healthcare. The fact that there's any room at all for education, I think, says a lot. The sad thing, though, is that the policies coming from this administration are almost identical to those of the previous administration. And what they don't seem to understand is that more of what failed is unlikely to produce different results. Because the Bush administration adopted the most sweeping federal education policy this country's ever seen in No Child Left Behind. And I would be the first to admit that No Child Left Behind did do some good things. Because for the first time in this country's history, we had a law that said there must be evidence that students are learning in school. It seems like, wow, what were we doing before? Well, what we were doing before is we literally had kids who could graduate from high school functionally illiterate. That's what we were doing. So now we had a law that said, no, there has to be real evidence, and we're going to disaggregate the data. We're going to make sure that all of them, special ed students, English language learners, all of them are learning. Bush went a step further and said that if they're not learning, it's probably because of the soft bigotry of low expectations. Pretty deep, isn't it? Not sure if he knew what that meant, but it was a very profound way of reframing the issue, wasn't it? Because up until that time, if kids weren't learning, especially if they were non-white and poor, we blamed them. The history of this country was to blame their culture or to blame their genes. We never expected all kids could achieve. We never even thought the achievement gap was something that could be closed, because we thought it was a natural phenomenon. Bush administration changed it. I said, no, 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 all of them. All of them. So I have to say that was definitely a step forward. But just a small step. Because you can't simply command schools to produce evidence of learning, and if the only evidence they look at is a standardized test, then you get a whole nother set of problems. Because now what we're seeing is schools, in the name of getting kids to pass these high-stakes exams, are taking away everything from the curriculum that's now on the test. So if music's not on the test, music's out. Art is out, definitely not on the test. Phys ed, the time when obesity is the #1 health challenge for kids in the country, obesity, phys ed taken away. Recess, taken away, not on the test. So a study recently said that lunch was good for test scores. I said, thank God. Thank God they might take lunch too. Well, let's be clear, they only do that to poor children. Middle class children get lunch and recess and phys ed and art and gymnastics. They get the whole works. Poor kids for whom this curriculum's been narrowed. Even though the slogan, "No Child Left Behind," that slogan didn't come from the Bush administration. It came from the Children's Defense Fund. Well, when Marion Wright Edelman came up with the slogan, it didn't mean test the kids as frequently as possible. It literally meant make sure that they all get good health and nutrition, because in a wealthy nation, we've got to do a better job of taking care of our kids. So we've been pursuing No Child Behind, and as I said, the Obama administration is pretty much pursuing the same strategies. They think it's simply a branding problem, so now they call it Race for the Top. But there's really not much difference there. Continue to use pressure and humiliation as a strategy for improving schools. So we'll label a school failing, as if labeling it was actually a way of improving it. State of Florida puts letter grades on schools. You go to an A school all the way down to an F school. Now, I would think that if the state puts an F on the building and still allows children to go there, the state should be sued. If Pitzer told you this building was condemned, but let us meet here anyway, we'd say, what's going on here at Pitzer? Went to Edison High School in Miami, a triple F school. And asked the principal, how do you get to be a triple F? He said, well, you simply failed the state exam 3 years in a row. I said, well, what happens if you fail a 4th time? He said, well, we will fail a 4th time. Because 85% of our kids don't speak English. And they can't pass an exam in English. So we'll fail again. And now the state says they'll take us over. So I asked, are you worried about being taken over? He says, not at all. Because there are too many schools just like us. They can't take us over. He says, what's more, do you think the state of Florida would know what to do if they took us over? Do you think there's some secret recipe they've been holding back on? And if they get control of Edison High School, they will now make available for those students? What's the record of state takeovers? Well, California knows. You've had state of California took over Compton schools. Finally gave up on Compton, not because Compton is now the model district, but because they just didn't want to be there anymore. We use gimmicks, we use pressure, we use humiliation. Now this current administration just uses commands. We want them to transform. We'll give you money, transform, fire the principal. As a part of your transformation, read the New York Times today, you'll see, now they're realizing, guess what? Can't fire principals because no one to replace them. Who's waiting for that job? Who's qualified for that job? So we continue to pursue policies which don't take us where we need to be, and then every time another international study comes out showing that we fall further and further behind, they get pissed. So the TIMSS study comes out. TIMSS compares math and science achievement amongst the 30 wealthiest nations in the world. Last time it came out, we were behind Slovenia. That really pissed off members of Congress. Many of them didn't know Slovenia was a country. We would be behind Slovenia. The Pitzer study came out just 2 months ago. We were 37th in math. Got everybody excited again. What's going on? How can we keep falling further and further behind? But we never asked the next question. What are they doing that we don't do? President Obama in his address said that we should be more like the South Koreans. The South Koreans refer to teachers as nation builders. South Korea would be a good country to imitate because South Korea was not even ranked amongst the top 50 countries in education 20 years ago. Now it's ranked in the top 10. What does South Korea do differently? It invests in teachers. It makes sure that teachers are well trained. It also makes sure that all kids have access to preschool. Isn't it ironic that we've been talking about closing the achievement gap for so long and completely ignore all the research that the learning that occurs during infancy lays the foundation for learning that will occur throughout their lifetime? In fact, we have good research showing that Head Start, even as flawed as it may be in many places, has been the most effective anti-poverty program this country's ever adopted. Because all the research shows that they compare the kids who got Head Start to the ones who didn't, that their outcomes over the course of their lifetime are superior. More likely to graduate, more likely to go to college, earn more money. It's cost effective. It's not even part of the national discussion in education reform today. So, we find ourselves stuck as a nation, spinning our wheels, because we need more than slogans to fix our schools. And we need more than commands coming from the president or from superintendents or from governors, because we actually have to know what's going on in school, why school failure is so common, particularly where poverty is concentrated. And that's the issue they don't want to really deal with. In fact, when Secretary Duncan was asked recently whether or not the PISA scores and results were a reflection of inequality, he said absolutely not. Poverty is not the issue. And anyone who says it, he argued, is saying that poor kids can't achieve. That's an interesting spin, isn't it? Now, I've been taking the opposite position for a while. I've been part of a national policy advocacy group called the Broader and Bolder Approach that's been arguing that policy is the issue. So is inequality. And that schools can't solve these problems by themselves. In fact, what we need is a more comprehensive strategy. Because if we don't find ways to provide more support to schools, we'll continue to have failure, particularly failure where poverty is concentrated. However, the current administration, and I would add, not just the current administration, the whole wave of reformers from Michelle Rhee, former chancellor of Washington, D.C. Public Schools, and Joe Klein, the former chancellor of New York, have continued to argue that poverty is not the issue. The issue is bad teachers. And if we could simply find ways to fire bad teachers, we could fix this. And isn't that, in fact, what the message of Waiting for Superman was? That is, even for those of you who didn't see it, even though they look, for the most part, not only at schools in very poor communities, and hold up charters to be the better solution, even though the research shows that not all charters are better. They never at all talk about how poverty is impacting learning and how it affects schools. Even though the research about the effects of poverty has been staring them in the face for the last 40 years. Anthony Bright, who was at the University of Chicago, wrote a book with several colleagues called Organizing for School Improvement. And they asked the question, why was it that 10 years of school reform, much of it carried out under Arne Duncan's leadership when he was the superintendent in Chicago, why didn't it bring about better results? What do they find? That in the schools that served the poorest kids, issues related to poverty were undermining the reforms. The schools can't do it alone. The ETS produced another study this year called Why Aren't We Making More Progress? It found the same thing. Because we stopped trying to fight and counter the effects of poverty. You don't need a whole lot of research to know that hungry kids don't do that well in school. And there are hungry children in America. And sick kids sometimes will miss lots of days, particularly kids with asthma, and lots of poor children have asthma, and lots of poor families don't have access to good health care, so they use emergency rooms for primary health care. And that when communities that are struggling with all the social conditions that accompany poverty, often like crime and violence, are unable to respond to them on their own, those issues often come up and show up in schools, and in fact student learning. Safety is an educational issue. And we have communities in this country where kids are not even guaranteed safe passage to and from school. Los Angeles knows that probably better than any other city in the country. We, as policymakers, attempt to ignore those issues and simply assume that if we just demand more of schools that we'll get better results, even though we now have almost 10 years of evidence showing it's not working. We have dropout rates of almost 50% and higher in every major city in the United States. If there weren't clear evidence that this is not working, that's it. At the same time, we have examples of success showing us what does work. And that raises another question. Why aren't we learning from success? Why aren't we doing more of what works? Let me describe what works. I was asked to go visit a school in PS 28 in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn. The principal kept calling. She said, Pedro, I want you to come see my school. So finally I got out there. It's very far, but this is actually the neighborhood where I grew up. So I wanted to see, because she told me it was a high-performing school. So I arrive and I'm greeted by her and her guard, and in New York, every school has a guard. It's a friendly guard. That was surprising, first of all. And there's artwork, and she says, welcome to my school, beautiful school. She introduced me to her secretary. She said, I want you to meet the person who really runs the school. And I laughed, yeah, secretary runs the school. She said, no, I'm serious. She does all the administrative work. She's a super secretary. I said, well, what do you do? She said, well, I'm the lead teacher. So I let my teachers know I had become a principal to escape the classroom. I became the principal to lead the classroom. She says, come on, let me show you. So she takes me to classrooms. And in every classroom I visit, there are 3 and 4 adults in the classroom. The first thing I'm curious, where do you get all these adults from? She said, well, that's a special ed teacher. That's a librarian. That's a counselor. She said, every adult here is in the classroom. Every adult is working with kids. We work with them in groups, we work with them individually, we give them whatever it is they need. She explained to me that the school stays open every day till 8 o'clock at night. So why is that? She said, because my kids need more, because 40% of my kids are homeless. They live in shelters, so they don't have a place to be after school. So we make sure there's a place for them to be, and so that's when we provide art and music and swimming lessons and a full range of activities, because we want to make sure they get an enriched education. At one point I'm watching a class and I see a little boy raise his hand. The teacher, without interrupting herself, nods. He gets up out of his seat, go to the restroom. About 8 years old. So I'm curious, because I know in many schools going to the restroom is a major issue. So I look to see where he goes, and does he come back? And he goes to the bathroom, comes right back. I said, that's very good. She said, what's that? I said, he went to the bathroom. I don't see any guards. I don't see any supervision. She said, you think that's good? She said, my kids have to walk on the most dangerous streets in New York City. So if I can't teach them to go to the bathroom responsibly, then I haven't accomplished anything. That's pretty good. She'll come. Takes me to another room, and there's 2 social workers who are doing a professional development workshop for teachers on how to respond to the social and emotional needs of children. This is not a pat workshop. This is teachers confronting the social workers with real issues that they're facing with their kids. A lot of these kids are stressed out. One teacher says, I've got a kid with attachment issues. He's attached to my leg. I can't teach. Try this. Try to make him earn your attention. She gives him some strategies. Let's come back in 2 days to see it doesn't work. Another kid with anger problems. And what impressed me was the fact that they were working it through. And I sort of asked the principal, what made you decide to offer this kind of professional development for your teachers? She said, well, until I did it, my teachers were referring too many of my kids to special education. And I realized the only way I could stop that is if I increased their skills so they could work with our kids. She then explains to me that in addition to offering this for her teachers, she has ESL classes for parents, GED classes for parents, in a partnership with a job training agency. She's able to provide training for parents who want to become nurses' aides and security guards. They're there at the school too. I said, well, what made you decide to do that? She said, well, I know that if my parents are educated and working, they'll do a better job with their kids. So I said, well, this is really good. She said, well, let me introduce you to my counselor. She takes me to an older African-American man. She said, first thing I have to tell you is I got him from the rubber room. Now, those of you who don't know, in New York City, they have a place called the rubber room where they put teachers nobody wants. You can be sent there for years and get paid, but you have to report there at your desk and sit there, do yoga, whatever you do, but you're not allowed to teach kids. Get paid for years. Big scandal. I said, well, what made you decide to get him from the rubber room? She said, well, I don't know why he was in the rubber room. But as soon as I heard he was there, I requested him because he had been my guidance counselor when I was in school. And I knew he was good. So I asked him to come to my school. And now he's working with my kids. So I go in there and I meet him, and he introduced me to the little boy he's talking to. So I asked the little boy, why are you here? He said, well, I'm learning how to be good. So is it working? He says, well, I hope so. I'm trying. I'm tired of getting put out the classroom. But what struck me was that this was really a counseling session. This was not about sending him home to go watch TV under the guise of punishment. They really think that the goal of discipline is to teach kids to become responsible for the behavior, not to push them out. So I leave it, and she actually, I have to show you one more thing before you go. And she takes me to her office and she shows me her data system. And she explains to me that for every single student in the school, they are monitoring their performance, they know exactly where they are, they know exactly which kid needs which support, because they're not leaving anything to chance. She shows me how it works, she shows me the portfolio of each student's work. It's highly organized, very focused, very deliberate. Wow, this is very, very good. So as soon as I get back, I send an email to the chancellor, Joel Fry. I say, Joel, you need to go visit the school. They're doing extraordinary things at PS 28. And Joel, 2 days later, shows up at the school and comes away very impressed. So impressed that he sends out a memo to every principal in New York City, 1,600 principals. He tells them what he saw, except that he only talks about one thing, the data system, and the way it was being used. So I write to Joel, I said, Joel, I'm glad you visited, but you missed it. It's not just the data system. It's all those other things, the parent education, social and emotional learning, all those things that make this school successful. But again, that speaks to that narrow vision that too often is that's guiding our schools. I think you about Brockton High School, Massachusetts. Brockton High School is a school that was featured in the front page of the New York Times a few months ago. It is in the 90th percentile in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the highest performing state in the country. It is a school where over 90% of the kids are color, over 70% of the kids are poor, qualify for free reduced lunch. Talking to the principal, I said, how did you produce these kind of results? She said, well, 10 years ago we were a failing school. Until a group of my teachers got together and decided what would transform our school was a focus on literacy. Because we had too many kids entering high school who were reading at an elementary school level. So we decided that every teacher would have to be a teacher of literacy. Not just the English teachers, the science teachers, the music teachers, the art teachers, the PE teachers. Everybody would teach literacy. And we would monitor it, we would give them feedback, we would give them training, but we would make sure that everybody was consistently following the same approach. And lo and behold, it worked. And Brockton High is proving that race and class need not be an obstacle to high achievement when the teachers actually know how to educate the children they serve. Now, I could go on and give you examples like these because there are many of them. Education Trust has identified over 3,000 high-performing, high-poverty schools. A book by Karen Chandler called It's Being Done, which looks closely at these schools and examines what's different about these schools. Why are these schools experiencing success when so many others experience failure? Again, the question is, why aren't we doing more of what works? The new book out in a month by David Kirk, called Kids First. He's asking the same kinds of questions. We have a number of practices that we know work. Extended learning time works. Quality summer school works. Early intervention really works. A whole lot better than late intervention. I could go on and on of what works. Now the question is, why don't we do what works? Why is it still so common to go to schools where they take the kids who are the most challenging, the furthest behind, and assign them the least experienced teacher? Tell me why that happens. Why is that such a common practice throughout this country? Or rounding up kids with challenges together, bring them all together. We have pretty good evidence that you bring together a lot of kids with a lot of problems, you get more problems. More problems. So I think the big challenge is the fact that we don't do what we know works, what the evidence shows works. Even though the number of schools where it's happening are right there for us to learn from. I was talking recently with the new governor of New York, because this is the time of, New York's got a similar situation, though not as bad as California, shrinking budgets, lots of cuts. He said that we can't just cut, we have to, because kids are still coming, we have to also move it forward. What can we do? I said, well, why not highlight and give people a chance to learn from the schools that are making a difference? But our policymakers focus too much on gimmicks, on quick fixes. As if there's a policy lever, if you just pull that lever, voila, all the schools will be transformed. And it never works that way, does it? Never does. Despite the hype and even despite the money that's spent. It took the Gates Foundation $2 billion to realize making schools smaller was no guarantee they'd be better. $2 billion. They don't even talk about small schools anymore, Gates. Now they talk about judging teachers by test scores. That's their latest fad and fixation. And I keep challenging them again. I said, if you want teachers to teach to the test, then judge teachers by test scores. If you want to drive out some teachers from teaching in challenging schools where it's harder to produce better results, judge teachers by test scores. But unfortunately, those with power and money often think that power and money gives you all the answers. And they're not likely to visit or learn from these schools that I described. I'll describe one more and then open it up for questions. PS 138. PS 138, the school in the South Bronx. Part of the Bronx that burned in the 1970s. It burned because the landlord decided it was better to burn their property and collect insurance than to fix it up. So in the 1980s, it looked like a war zone. It looked like abandoned buildings and burnt out buildings everywhere. This is a community that Jimmy Carter described as one of the poorest communities in the United States. Gangs, drug use, high HIV rates. My grandmother lived in that community for over 20 years. In the housing project there on Willis Avenue. So when I was told that the kids at PS 138 were in a high-performing school, I said, I got to see this. So I show up at PS 138, and I'm greeted by a 4th grade girl, and she says, well, I'm your tour guide. Okay. She said, well, first let me show you all the awards we've won. The news articles and citations. She's clearly very proud. It's a very impressive display, and then she takes me to the library. She explains to me that every month there's a contest for which class reads the most books. Real books, not excerpts from books. And she takes me to their science lab, and it's just beautiful with animals and plants, and you just want to study science from the time you enter the room. And there's student work on the walls, and I said, wow, this is so impressive. She said, do you think this is good? Let me take it upstairs. Go to the second floor, and I learned that the only museum in New York City that's dedicated to the history of the Bronx is in their school. Museum in the school. It's not in a classroom, it's in a hallway. The first thing you see when you walk up the stairs is a picture of the Yankees from the 1920s. When Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig were on the same team. Picture of Joe Louis when he fought Max Schmeling. Picture of the Bronx family, a German family spelled their name with a K. Owned a large farm. Is the first album by Donald Byrd, the jazz artist, encased in the wall because he grew up in that neighborhood. And so did his student, Willie Colon. There's furniture and memorabilia and all kinds of clothing from the 20s and 30s, all on display. And the first thing I can think of as I walk through these halls is that it's all within easy reach of kids. It can easily be vandalized or stolen or broken. So I turn to a little girl and I ask her, aren't they worried the kids might damage some of this? The little girl looks at me like I'm some kind of sicko. She says, well, I don't know about schools you go to normally. But at this school, kids really take care of things. Now, why do I even ask the question? Because I'm so accustomed to going to school with kids that are treated like inmates in prison. Schools like the one I visited in Oakland, middle school, where I visit a science classroom and I see there's no science equipment. And I asked the teacher, where's your science equipment? She said, well, I lock it up. I said, you lock it up? She said, I lock it up so they don't break it. And then I asked, well, do they ever get to use the science equipment? She said, well, occasionally when they're well behaved, I'll bring out the science equipment. I could tell by the way she said it, that didn't happen too often. Reminded me, you ever go to someone's house and they have their furniture covered? Like they're waiting for a special guest to come? You know, if you come and it's still covered, you're not that guest. Kids at 138 are treated like special guests each and every day, and they respond like they are. The existence of schools like these show us the problem is not the kids. The problem is the way we treat kids. The problem is our inability, and I would say even our unwillingness to create more schools like the ones I described. I'm not going to say it's easy to do this, but I'm going to say it is possible. And the proof is the fact that such schools exist right now. Thank you.
But what can I say to a junior high school student of middle class that doesn't have a drug dealer as his idol, but doesn't have an astronaut as an idol? He asks me, why go to school? What am I going to be? What's the immediate answer? Because at that point, someone asked me, and he had asked me. So I put myself as an example for my own trajectory that I gave it, and then still not enough for that junior high school students. That is involved in the arts and the course, but it still doesn't suffice. What can I say to that?
What I would say is, if you can, build that relationship with the student so that he can see, not just hear what you've done, but see how education has impacted your life and why you believe that it is a pathway to a better life. He needs to also, if you can get him, excited about learning, to figure out what he's interested in. Because a lot of times, especially with middle school students, not only can't they see the future very clearly, they also have not been stimulated and challenged because much of what interests them is not happening in school. And in many ways, the way they learn outside of school is never tapped in school. The typical middle school student knows more about technology and is more comfortable with it than the typical teacher. And we will take away their cell phone, we'll take away their iPods instead of using those as learning tools because we're intimidated. We don't know what the hell those things can do. We don't know how those happen. And so a big part of it is that in many ways they're not being stimulated sufficiently in school, and therefore they don't yet believe that this is something that can work. But I would say that building that relationship can make a huge difference. My son, who is living in LA and working for City Year this year, is a tutor at a school in East LA, Hollenbeck Middle School. And I went to visit, and he introduced me to one of his students, middle school student, and when the student left, he said, when I first started tutoring him, he couldn't even spell his name. He didn't know his letters. They said he was severely disabled. He says, now he's reading, he can do everything. I said, what's the difference? He said, I just kept encouraging him. I started playing basketball with him at lunchtime. He built the relationship. And suddenly this student is thriving. And all of his teachers say they couldn't believe that this student could make such a result, such a turnaround. And it just, again, we get so many reminders of the importance of relationships, particularly with adolescents. Yes.
With PS 28 that you described, it seems like there would have to be extra funds to provide all those services to stay open until 8. Did that school get extra funds, and if so, how did they use that?
She is a very creative builder of partnerships. So her teachers don't stay till 8. The Y runs the second shift. Now she's there till 8, so she puts in a lot of time. She also has her daughter in that school. But it's just like the job training for the parents, she doesn't provide it. Another agency comes, uses her facility to provide that to parents. So she networks with other agencies to provide services that her students and that the community that they need. But that's because she's a networker. She understands the importance of social capital for developing schools that respond to student needs.
Two things. One, how would you suggest going against standardized testing, given that it doesn't actually prove much for knowledge in children and also high school students? And two, how do you think the Columbia acquisition of most of Harlem affects the community at the schools there?
I mean, it's very hard right now because of politics to challenge standardized testing. Although I think, we've got to continue. I was explaining earlier today, the way we're using testing is such an abuse of the way in which assessment should be used. Assessment should be used, any educator knows, it should be used for diagnostic purposes, to diagnose learning needs, not simply to rank people. Ranking does not help them. Right now, we test the kids in the spring, we give the teachers the results in the fall when they no longer have the students. So as far as using it to provide feedback to teachers on what the students need more of, that opportunity is gone. So that's what we've got to challenge. There's got to be other ways, and I can give you lots of examples of schools that have found other ways that don't involve lowering standards to assess students and ensure that they've acquired the real core skills they need, like literacy and critical thinking and all those things. So there are other ways, but it's a political issue. And we've got to find ways to convince the Assembly and Governor that there is another way to go about this that does not mean that we're giving up on high standards for kids. With respect to Columbia, it remains to be seen what's going to happen. They have acquired through eminent domain a big portion of land in West Harlem. They're going to build a big biotech center. There are concessions they're supposed to make to the residents. It's not clear yet what those are going to look like and who's going to benefit, but so that's an ongoing issue. Here and then I'll come on.
A lot of what you talk about is that schools can't do it on their own. You need community and just tons of support. So what would you recommend to an individual teacher, if not even to the school? And if you're like a new teacher, not even a principal?
I always recommend you need allies. You need allies. First, I would recommend finding allies among your colleagues who share your commitment. So because teacher isolation is the biggest obstacle to school improvement. But then your parents can be your allies. If you can cultivate good, constructive relationships, get parents supporting their kids, that can make a huge difference. Students can be allies too. So that I would say at the minimum, limited what you can do as an individual teacher to transform a school, but if you can build some alliances with colleagues, teachers, and students, it'll make the job a lot easier. in the middle, yes.
You made a statement about how, so frequently the least experienced teachers are paired with the kids with the greatest needs and most challenging. On that, what's your feeling about Teach for America?
Well, I spoke about it earlier. I mean, I'm not against Teach for America, okay, because, but I also don't see it as a solution either. Many of the people, cause the reason why I'm not against it is because in many of the schools I go to, I see really good young people who come out of Teach for America, who are teaching kids, who are working real hard, who are building those relationships. So, why, I mean, sometimes they're the best teachers, just because they're giving the most. And so why could, I can't be against that. At the same time, the fact that on average they only spend 2 years, that's not good enough. By the time they leave, they're not even effective. Right? And I also, the idea that we would send these untrained teachers into the most challenging classrooms makes no sense at all. So I think there's a lot that's wrong with holding it up as a solution to the problems facing our schools. But to you know, right now in education, a lot of people say, well, you know, we fight these battles that actually distract us sometimes. You know, a lot of people right now fighting over Teach for America, fighting about charter schools. You know, I'm not against charter schools if they're good. I'm not against any school that's good. What I'm against is allowing so many schools to flounder for so long, and so many students not receive an education. And I think if we could channel more political will to address that issue, we could have a greater impact.
You talked a lot about how building a relationship with a student is very key to fostering their learning and therefore improving their overall educational experience. But especially I'm a California resident, our average class size is 33 students. High schools have 2,000 kids in them. How do you suggest putting something like PS 38 in a high school setting with 2,000 kids in such a small budget now that we have? What would you say to administrators?
You know, first of all, the situation is becoming more and more untenable, right? So that this is not, you know, this magic can't necessarily solve it. At the same time, resourceful principals will find ways to make a bad situation work as best it can. So, for example, I was at Fontana High School, okay, not far from there, when Sergio Ramirez was still principal. And what he had done at the school was he figured out honors classes can be large. Because honors kids, usually no behavior problems, they just do the work, but those 9th grade classes, keep them small. Because there's more challenges there. So he was deliberately making choices about which classes to let grow, which classes to keep small, where to place teachers. Fontana, at least at the time, this was about 2 years ago, had more kids passing the AP Calculus exam than any other high school in the county. I said, what do you attribute that to? He said, we have the best math department. And then he introduced me, and I had to come away and say, well, I can see, they're serious about teaching. Here's the big problem in high school. Too many high school teachers teach like the worst college professors. I can say that as one, right? Because why? Because college professors lecture. And teaching and talking are not the same. And if you have teachers who expect kids to learn the way they teach, and then fail the ones who don't, then you're going to end up with lots of kids failing. And what you see in a lot of high schools where you have high dropout rates is you see lots of kids who are failing and teachers act like they have nothing to do with it. Because they take no responsibility for learning. So I would say that even under these very difficult fiscal constraints, we should not just say, well, there's nothing we can do. The kids are still showing up. And we've got to figure out, okay, how do we get resourceful and try to make it work to the best we can, even as we challenge the priorities of the state. So, right here, and then I'll go back.
You briefly talked about kind of the comparison of schools being more like prisons. I attended Pitzer High School in Bronx. I graduated from 2007. Historically, that was one of the biggest schools, and now it's completely different. My year, they started airport style metal detectors, so pretty much for the last 2 years of my high school, I wore no just steal another girl with my name of Perez, and the system mixed us up. So they came searching for me because she got in a fight. So it's something as simple as that. And I do believe that I think there's a difference between surveillance and discipline. So, or even discipline, I have a problem with that terminology. I guess my stance is, how do you see what's going on with the zero tolerance policy in New York, and what do you think is the most effective way to get schools to function? I mean, my school again was 5,000 students in the building with 34 kids in the classroom, and we still graduated with the top students. I'm a testament to that, but you know what I mean? So like, what would your fancy to discipline that policy?
It's sad what's happened to Clinton, because Clinton was historically one of the better high schools in the Bronx. Now because they get screened, you literally have kids who come to school on time in the cold, lined up outside, waiting to go through the metal detector. So they end up going to class late because they can't even screen them in on time. So, I mean, the kids are showing up, and the school simply because so that you missed the first period. So, I would say that what we've got to realize, you know, you see this in New York. You see one school that's run like a little prison with the guards and the police, and next school sometimes next door, no guards, no metal detector. Same population. What's the difference? It's the culture of the school. Schools where kids are not learning are schools that will be unsafe. You have to focus on that connection to learning. You have to focus, because if the kids are not invested in learning, then you're going to see kids who are distracted, kids who are getting into trouble. And so, you know, it is, what the zero tolerance has done, policies, is it's increased criminalization. So you see kids being arrested now for offenses that were never even treated as criminal offenses in the past. Especially in New York, you're seeing that right now. ACLU just did a study on that. But you're also seeing schools that are where the other needs of kids, the learning needs. So instead of investing in counselors, we invest in security. Instead of investing in labs, we've got metal detectors. It distorts the priorities away from learning and onto security. And it undermines the ability of the school to meet students' needs. And again, you know, what's interesting about zero tolerance is the zero tolerance policies were adopted in the aftermath of the mass shootings at Columbine and other schools like that, almost all of which occurred in mostly white middle-class communities. Right? But it was when it was brought into the inner city that we got the prison-like response to children. We don't do that to middle-class kids for the most part. It was way back then. Yes?
I've had a lot of experiences in high school with really, really bad teachers who are protected by the teachers union. I was wondering, what's your opinion on the teachers union? Yeah.
Well, it's complicated. I think there are cases where clearly the unions see it as their job to protect their members and make it difficult to remove teachers who are either incompetent or unprofessional, right? And and what I challenge unions is that actually undermines confidence in teaching. Because if everyone knows there's someone on staff who should not be there, it starts to diminish the way in which we look at teachers. So, in my opinion, when unions play that role, they're actually hurting themselves. At the same time, it is too simplistic to say, well, the union is the problem. Right? I mentioned earlier that the states that are the most unionized also have the best results. Massachusetts is a heavily unionized state, it's the top performing state. Mississippi, no unions. One of the lowest performing states. So if it was simply the union, then you would see in places like Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas much better schools, and you don't. So it's more to it than that, but it's not to say that unions aren't sometimes obstructing change. But as I said, Brockton High School, it was teachers who led the reform initiative. So I think we have to be thoughtful in how we approach it. Unions have a role to play, right, in protecting the rights of teachers. Right? And in fact, in many cases, unions, in protecting those rights, also protect student rights. However, it can get distorted, and sometimes it does. And when what's good for teachers is not good for kids, that's a real problem. Go here, and then I'll come back. Yes.
When talking about high poverty schools, you oftentimes, one
Well, we've known this for a long time, that one of the crucial issues for adolescents is the search for identity, right? Figuring out who am I, right? And who am I is both an individual, personal question, but it's also a social question, right? And if kids don't see their history, their culture, their identity reflected in what they learn, it often contributes to alienation. It's very interesting because Jaime Escalante, who died not too long ago, teacher at Garfield High, he was a math teacher. But Jaime Escalante used culture to teach math. Right? And he would tell the kids, you are the descendants of people who built pyramids. You can do calculus. And why is that important? Because so often our kids think that education, this goes to your point, that this is not part of who they are, right? This is not part of their identity. And we have to, if you don't do that, if you don't change it, because we live in a country where the stereotypes related to race and gender are insidious and mostly negative. And the stereotypes facing particularly black and Latino boys are that you have a better chance being a ball player or a rapper or a gangster than being an engineer or a poet, right? And if you don't create schools that can counter those stereotypes, so that kids can believe they can do whatever they want, then those stereotypes will take control of the schools. And so having a curriculum that both affirms their identity but also that challenges those stereotypes is really essential to creating schools that are able to break the cycle of poverty and able to get kids to do things that might otherwise not be possible. Yes?
So we're sitting on like a huge pile of resources at this college. Just kind of wondering, are there any like successful university public school partnerships that you can talk about, and what have college students done at using university resources or outside of university resources to work with public school students?
Yeah, there are many examples, but not enough, though. Not enough. Universities, think about it. We have, the United States is still regarded as having the premier system of higher education in the world. So how could it be that we have the premier system of higher education and lousy K-12? Something's wrong with this picture. Well, that's partially because the relationships between higher ed and K-12, they're not strong. We don't have a pipeline from the schools to the universities, and we don't have good exchanges between faculty, universities, and teachers. Not enough. Now, there are examples. I'm actually going to be at the University of Chicago tomorrow, where there is, the University of Chicago has helped to develop 5 new schools on the south side. Not the school that Obama said his kids to, which is the lab school for the elite kids. But these are kids on the south side. And there are other, UCLA has some great partnerships with some schools. And there are a number of universities now that are starting to realize that that part of being a good citizen means being present in the community and using their resources to extend beyond. University of California had the MESA program. I'm not sure, they still have MESA? Okay, MESA is a great model for getting particularly kids of color into math and engineering fields. So we have some models. The problem is that they're small, they're not as accessible as they should be, and they're not being expanded the way they should be. But, some of what, again, we can't say, well, simply because we don't have the money, we can't do anything. Because we have human resources. You have students here at Pitzer who can tutor, right? Work as mentors of kids. You don't need to be in city area. You just need a partnership. I know my colleague Louis Rodriguez, who's at Cal State San Bernardino, is doing that with San Bernardino schools. And I know there's probably other partnerships here in the room that I'm not aware of. But we need to do more of that. I remember when I was at Berkeley, one of my students was teaching at a local charter school. They just formed as a charter school for mostly Chicano students in East Oakland. And she called me, she said, like 2 days before school was open, she said, we have no building. I said, what do you mean have no building? She said, the landlords won't sign the lease, we have no place to put our kids. We can't open school, can you help? I said, well, I can get some classes at Berkeley. You can teach there. So, for the first month of school, kids were taking class at Berkeley. I didn't ask anyone's permission. Chicago middle school students all over the place. People said, where are these kids? But had I asked for permission, you can be sure I wouldn't have happened. I said, no, you can't do school at the university. What kind of crazy thing to do that? But, you know, we have an abundance of resources that we are not creatively tapping to address these challenges, and we should. And I would hope that that's one thing that can happen here more, is some creative thinking about how to build these partnerships.
I'm going to ask everybody to really thank you for joining us.